When looking at the cultural, economic, and political interests that divided the North and South, it's only natural to focus on the decades immediately preceding the Civil War. But much of the animosity between the two sections dated back to before the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, when the government was organized under the Articles of Confederation. Perhaps no example better illustrates this point than a treaty with Spain that was never even ratified. The proposed treaty in question was negotiated in 1786 by American Foreign Secretary John Jay of New York, later the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Diego de Gardoqui, the Spanish minister to the United States. As historian William J. Cooper explains, Jay was eager to boost American commerce, and Gardoqui, speaking for his government, wanted to arrest American expansion toward the Southwest. Possessing Florida and Louisiana while refusing to recognize American claims to the territory between the Ohio River and Florida, Spain feared encroachment on her empire by the vigorous young nation to the north. Jay and Gardoqui reached an agreement that had the Mississippi as its fulcrum. In return for American renunciation of claims to navigate the Mississippi for 25 years, Spain would open her markets to American commerce. The South was aghast. At the time, future President James Monroe was a Virginia delegate to the Congress of the Confederation, which was based in New York City. Monroe had written Congress's instructions to Jay, which explicitly stipulated free navigation of the Mississippi. During congressional debate on the treaty, Monroe said, "This is one of the most extraordinary transactions I have ever known. A minister negotiating expressly for the purpose of defeating the object of his instructions." Monroe biographer Tim McGrath writes that Massachusetts delegate Rufus King suspected the personal financial motives of Monroe and other Southerners. Unlike most Northeastern veterans of the Revolution, Southern veterans had purchased thousands of acres as payment for their service. King knew that some colleagues, Monroe in particular, had gone broke buying up frontier territory. But it wasn't just Monroe's interests at stake. Cooper writes that many Americans in all parts of the country recognize that because of the hardships associated with overland transportation, especially when it involved crossing the mountains, rivers were essential avenues of trade and, of course, prosperity. For Tennessee and Kentucky, the Great River provided not only their western boundaries, but also the only expeditious route connecting them with the open sea and the major markets for the products of their farms and plantations. Without access to the Mississippi, Tennessee and Kentucky could never prosper. In addition to the obvious and direct interests of those two states, along with their eastern parents, North Carolina and Virginia, South Carolina and Georgia also gazed fondly upon the Father of Waters, which marked the western limits of their land claims. Furthermore, the Jay-Gardoqui Treaty, as Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee complained, opened Spain to New England fish and wheat from New York and Pennsylvania, while prohibiting tobacco, which was vital to Southern economic interests. Infuriated by the proposed treaty, Monroe fired off a letter to Virginia Governor Patrick Henry, who had also invested heavily in Western lands. The object in the occlusion of the Mississippi is to break up, so far as this will do it, the settlements on Western waters, prevent any in future, and to thereby keep the states southward as they now are. In short, it is a system of policy which has for its object the keeping the weight of government and population in this quarter, and is pursued by a set of men so flagitious, unprincipled, and determined in their pursuits as to satisfy me beyond a doubt they have extended their views to the dismemberment of the government. Henry biographer Harlow Giles Unger writes that dismemberment of the fragile new government was a real possibility. Outraged settlers in Kentucky talked of forming a militia to march against the Spanish in New Orleans. Others threatened to reassert loyalty to the English king and invite British troops to reclaim the West and guarantee settler access to the Mississippi. To sell us and make us vassals to the merciless Spaniards, one Kentuckian raged in the Maryland Journal, is a grievance not to be borne. The threats of secession in the West emboldened New Englanders to call for establishment of a Northern Confederacy. The 5 states of New England, closely confederated, have nothing to fear, proclaimed a correspondent in the Boston Independent Chronicle. let then our General Assembly immediately recall their delegates from Congress as being a useless and expensive establishment. Send proposals for instituting a new nation of New England, and leave the rest of the continent to pursue their own imbecile and disjointed plans. In the end, Southern opposition held firm enough that the Jay-Gardoqui Treaty fell short of the 9 votes needed for congressional ratification. But Monroe never again trusted Jay, and as Cooper writes, the upshot of the treaty episode made the South even more wary of Northern intentions, for after all, the 7 states north of Maryland and Delaware were ready to sacrifice Southern concerns on the altar of their commercial desires. Not only more wary, the Southerners also became more acutely aware that they must guard jealously their own interests. Of the following year's convention that created the U.S. Constitution, Cooper observes, although the evidence is not completely unclouded, it seems that the Southerners acquiesced in an arrangement that everyone agreed would let the North dominate the coasting trade in return for Northern acceptance of the slave trade. The constitutional resolution kept the trade dispute at bay, but the South never lost sight of its perception of its own economic interests. The South would go to political war whenever it felt its economic fortunes endangered. American relations with Spain would go on to shape both the fate of the South and of the U.S. as a whole during the 19th century. I explore that topic in a supplementary post on my website, which is not paywalled. Click the link in the description below this video. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next episode.